You're listening to What's the Story, the official historical podcast of World of Tanks North America. Each episode, we dive into a tank-related topic with our host, Nicholas the Chieftain Moran.
Any discussion of the US's introduction to the war against Germany is going to include the Axis defeat at Kasserine Pass. The first time that the US Army met Axis forces, they got quite the shock, their reasonably rapid movement from Morocco and Algeria against less than motivated and less than well-equipped French forces hardly being a portent of the difficulties that a determined, capable opposition could pose. Or so it goes. And it is roughly true. Kasserine Pass, or more specifically the series of battles around the pass, for the pass itself was only a small subset of it, was a bloody nose for the Americans, a series of lessons taught by the harshest teacher of all, experience, which the US Army needed to incorporate by changes in leadership and tactics. But I'm going to go back to my first line. Some of you may be wondering, did I read out a typo when I said that? I said the Axis were defeated? It's true, and people seem to frequently misunderstand what a defeat is. The term is currently defined in U.S. doctrine in ADP 3-0 and states that defeat is to render a force incapable of achieving its objectives. The verbiage has modified slightly over the years, but has generally revolved about whether or not the enemy could achieve what it was trying to do. That is an entirely separate matter to whether or not your own side was able to achieve what it was trying to do. Both sides can be defeated by the enemy in the same battle. And in this case, the Axis were not able to achieve the purpose of their offensive. They were, however, able to give the Allied command structure a good, swift kick in the pants. But Kasserine wasn't the only place in that series of battles where they did it. One needs to go back a little bit before Kasserine in order to determine the larger picture. Kasserine, in February of 1943, was not the first time the US Army encountered the Germans. The first major Allied encounter with German forces in West Africa, outside of encountering some reconnaissance elements, occurred in late November 1942 at the town of Medjez El Bab. But the only American involvement of note was the participation of a US artillery unit. The first notable US-led engagement was an infantry encounter, 2nd of the 509th Parachute Infantry Regiment, kicking the Germans out of Gafsa and turning an Italian column back near El Guitar. They later turfed the Italians out of Sbetla, but in the large scheme of things, these were minor operations. The first US-German tank clash occurred a week later, 26 November, 1st Battalion, 1st Armoured Regiment under Lieutenant Colonel Waters, which was a light tank battalion with Stuarts. Waters would become more famous later in the war for being Patton's son-in-law, getting captured, and being the claimed object of the infamous Task Force Baum. At this point, though, he was part of what was known as Blade Force, in the vicinity of Chieftain Pass. They were doing relatively well. It turned out, for example, that a company of Stuarts can make a mess of German aircraft caught on the ground at an airfield. They knocked out some 3 dozen. Then they settled in to defend the exit of Chieftain Pass itself, the full battalion of about 55 tanks. Stuarts versus Panzer IVs with the long 7.5 and Semavente 47s may not seem like a fair battle, but the American tanks gave as good as they got. They killed about the same amount of tanks as they lost, 6 to 8, and they forced the Axis back into the pass, where the German commander was later court-martialed. Undoubtedly, this initial clash, which saw the German force turned back by mere light tanks, gave Americans the confidence that they had good training and good equipment, especially in the medium tanks, to continue to take the fight to the Germans. Of course, less observed was the fact that the American tanks were in defense and they greatly outnumbered the Germans. There were a few other small clashes, mainly in the British sector, which occasionally came with US tank or artillery support, but it would not be until the 1st of December that the Allies had to face a deliberate counterattack under General Fisher commanding 10th Panzer. This went much less well for the Allies, losing a number of Stuarts and Crusaders to an attacking unit which contained not only long-gun Panzer IVs, but the first 2 Tigers to be thrown into the Tunisian fray. Blade Force was effectively destroyed as a coherent unit, but strong defense by British infantry prevented major German advances. Medium tanks from 1st Armoured Division were amongst the reinforcements brought in, and a major fight developed around the town of Tabora. However, American tanks attempted solo attacks without even the coordination of artillery fire, and the Americans lost many of these tanks to little gain. As the fight attracted more attention, more rank also showed up, including General Oliver, then in charge of Combat Command B of 1st Armoured Division, and 13th Armour Regiment Commander Paul Robinette, a name which will feature again in the future. They put a halt to the attacking and decided that defense was more appropriate. Overall, the Allies had the advantage of defense, numbers, and artillery. The Germans had the advantages of experience and air support. In the end, it proved to be a 3-day battle decisively won by the Germans, who turfed the Allies out of Tabora. The Allies lost 55 tanks, 300 vehicles, and at least 1,000 men. The lost tanks were mainly American, but the lost men mainly British. Perhaps this is one reason why Kasserine, 3 months later, is more famous in American historiography, but Tabora was a definite wake-up call that not all was right in the American world. Another would come a few days later, at Jebel el Guessa. Again, the Germans seized the town with proper combined arms tactics, and again the Americans counterattacked by tanks unsupported by anything else. Arguably, more German tanks were killed by a trapped US howitzer unit than by US tanks, their 105s killing about 8 tanks before they had to surrender. At this point, even higher command were realizing that their operations, both strategic and tactical, were lacking, albeit sometimes still forced upon them. Eisenhower wrote, quote, "I think the best way to describe our operations to date is that they have violated every recognized principle of war, are in conflict with all operational and logistic methods laid down in textbooks, and will be condemned in their entirety by all Leavenworth and War College classes for the next 25 years." Unquote. A week later, an attempted attack by Germans to reduce the bridgehead at Mejez el-Bab was turned back with moderately heavy losses. They had tried a 3-pronged attack. American troops stopped 2 of them, but the Germans blew through a unit of Stuarts before being stopped at a block by French units. This prong was then counterattacked by light tanks and tank destroyers. The Americans came out the worst for the engagement, probably not helped by the presence of some Tigers, but the bridgehead was held. So we have another case of the Germans and Americans having a fair fight before Kasserine. However, a combination of bad weather and mud with supply difficulties meant that Eisenhower was going to be forced onto the defensive for a few weeks. Just before Christmas 42, an attempt to restart the offensive was made. Long Stop Hill was primarily a British battle, with American units attached, but the battle did not go well for the Americans. Actually, it didn't go particularly well for anyone, but the Americans suffered particularly from inter-army communications failures and just plain being outfought by a German unit to the tune of the rapid, complete loss of a company from the infantry battalion. The concept of going on an offensive was put on hold again for a few months, now because of the weather. This is where Fredendall now starts to enter the picture. With more forces entering the area, the command structure was no longer applicable. Besides, the French, doubtless remembering the Royal Navy's destruction of their ships in North Africa, as well as harbouring some resentment for abandoning France at Dunkirk, flat refused to be placed under British command. Instead of a multinational force being divided by region, such as British in the north and Americans in the south, what actually existed was generally British forces in the north with some Americans mixed in, most Americans in the south with some British mixed in, and French mixed in most everywhere. This needed to be sorted out, and 2 Corps was created to bring the Americans under a more self-contained command. The change wouldn't happen immediately, and in the meantime, units would take emergency orders from whoever sector they happened to be in, regardless of nationality. Still, the intent was there. Fredendall was not a neophyte to Corps command, nor poorly regarded. He had been very successful working up the new motorized division, and then commanded a corps, coincidentally 2 Corps, in the GHQ maneuvers. During Torch, he was a commander at Oran, which was the only objective of the landing swiftly taken by pure force of arms. It was quite successful. It wasn't just that Marshall liked him, that he got the command, and there was no particular reason to think that he would fail. In fact, there was no particular reason to think that whoever got put in charge of II Corps would have done much better or much worse than Friedendahl. It's a valid question to ask if he just ended up with the bad end of the stick. If he did have a failing, it was in his tendency to stay more in his command post than to travel to the front lines. However, it was his ball to run with. Much is made of the fact that Friedendahl dug his corps headquarters into caves in a mountain. It's often stated to be an indicator of cowardice, but though the Luftwaffe had certainly not been neutralized, it was mainly a quality of life matter. The corps staff simply worked better in the surprisingly miserable winter weather in caves than in tents. Now, whether that justified the expenditure in engineer man-hours, which could have been used elsewhere, well, that's another matter. The next set of battles didn't start until the second half of January. The initiative was taken by the Germans, after the Allies scrapped the plan, which, upon investigation, was not logistically supportable, which actually worked out for the better, as they were better able to respond to the German attacks of 18th of January. These attacks were focused on the British, who generally were able to hold their own, and the French, still somewhat under-equipped, and where the Germans broke through. II Corps was instructed to aid the French, and Friedendahl decided to send 1st Armored Division's Combat Command B, under the very capable Robinette. For whatever reason, Friedendahl bypassed Ward, the 1st Armored Division's commander, and called Robinette directly with a very infamous order. Imagine receiving the following. Move your command, i.e. the walking boys, pop guns, Baker's outfit, and the outfit which is the reverse of Baker's outfit, and the big fellows to M, which is due north of where you are now, as soon as possible. Have your boss report to the French gentleman, whose name begins with J, at a place which begins with D, which is 5 grid squares to the left of M. Now, if this was being transmitted by radio unencrypted, perhaps that's understandable, but the communication was by telephone line, and so likely not tapped. Regardless, however, Friedendahl did get the job done. The unit he selected was appropriate, well led, and achieved its goal of stabilizing the front, engaging German forces coming out okay for the exchanges. After asking Robinette what reinforcements he may need to complete the missions assigned by the French commander that Robinette was placed under, he supported Robinette without question and assigned those assets. On the other hand, Robinette was never entirely sure during this operation who his boss actually was. Still, it was another example of a sizable US force meeting Germans and giving a reasonable showing. And the Americans fought sensibly, not falling into enemy traps by what the Army Green Book describes as any, quote, ill-advised armored lunges. Operations in the Useltia Valley lasted until the end of January. They indicated, however, that it was unreasonable to expect the French, depleted and under-equipped, to hold a part of the line unsupported. So the Allies went more firm on the defensive to ensure another German attack against the French would not succeed, wait for the arrival of more US divisions, and then launch the next offensive in March, suitably reinforced and in better weather. That didn't mean that Friedendahl was committed to just sitting down and doing nothing. He wasn't the sort of person to do that. Plus, he realized he also had a whole bunch of green troops who had elephants that they needed to see. He ordered a raid from Gafsa into Sened, an ad hoc all-arms unit of 1st Armored Division doing the job. It proved a rousing success. For the loss of 2 wounded and 2 tanks damaged, they came home with almost 100 prisoners and an estimated equal amount killed or wounded. Before the Americans could conduct a follow-on operation, however, 21st Panzer attacked just to the north at Kasserine Pass in a strong raid of its own on 30th of January in a 3-pronged enveloping attack. It eventually seized the pass, and initial counterattacks by Combat Command A of 1st Armored ran into anti-tank ambushes. A new defensive line was set up by the Americans near Sidi Bouzid. Von Arnim, the German commander, however, cancelled his planned foray out of the pass due to the surprising number of American tanks which had been encountered. Meanwhile, further south, Fredendall had a choice between either moving forces north to contain the enemy around Fied Pass, or to attack east of Sened to Makassay, and thus threaten the enemy's southern flank. He chose the latter, but the objective was more heavily defended than anticipated. Still, in brisk fighting, the Americans took Maizala Pass and caused about as many casualties in Makassay as they took, also forcing the attentions of German reserves in that direction instead of Faid. Still, the attack was cancelled after 2 days before coming to a conclusion when the situation around Faid was proving to be more difficult than originally understood. The enemy's possession of Fied Pass meant that there was a weak point in the Allied line through which a subsequent attack could be launched. Pending some form of operation to recapture Fied Pass, probably in March, a defence was called for. The instructions Fredendall issued were to take an active defence with raids and patrols, but to start digging in immediately, using all barrier materials and mines. However, the instructions for the disposition were so detailed and specific that they took freedom of action away from Ward. Perhaps he didn't trust Ward, or perhaps Fredendall was simply taking his cue from his boss, the British Armoured Commander, Anderson, who was something of a micromanager himself and was considered successful. Either way, the instructed dispositions east of Sidi Bouzid were not ideal. In the meantime, the Allies started to reconfigure for a possible German attack. British 6th Armoured was drawn out of the line starting 12th February, leaving their Crusaders for the French to take up and moving to the rear to start conversion training to Shermans. Terrible timing, it turned out. 34th ID was barely starting to relieve the French forces on 13th of February. Of course, to be forewarned is to be forearmed. The Germans were expected to have another crack, and Allied intelligence was working on the problem. Finally, Eisenhower's intelligence officer concluded categorically that the Germans would attack, and attack through the French to engage British forces in the north. Understandably enough, as both Allies and Germans felt that the region near the coast was critical to the defence or capture of the Tunisian ports. Anderson, quite willing to believe this, made his dispositions accordingly. However, one thing Fredendall was good at was picking his staff, and in selecting his G2, he had picked a corker in Colonel Dixon. While higher command was relying on ultra signals, intercepts, and spies, Dixon was collating information from good old-fashioned aerial and ground reconnaissance. He became convinced that there would be an Axis attack in the south. The night before the German assault, he spoke for over a quarter hour with Anderson, attempting to convince him of the pending problem. Anderson asked probing questions, listened well, and then told Fredendall in front of Eisenhower, all of whom were present at Fredendall's headquarters that evening to discuss the threat, that his intelligence officer was jumpy. Like many senior Brits, Anderson was not particularly generous with his opinions on the new amateurs to the fight, unlike the experienced British. Not that Fredendall was an Anglophile either, but in this case a correct assessment of German intentions was ignored. After the battle, Eisenhower would replace his own intelligence chief. At 6 a.m. on Valentine's Day, the Axis forces sent some 200 tanks, complete with a company of Tigers to lead the way, streaming westwards towards the American lines east of Sidi Bouzid. Only 6 hours earlier, Eisenhower himself had stood there, looking east to the German-held pass, and wondering why so few mines had been laid. It turned out that there was a shortage, as well as a lack of emphasis. What is often underappreciated was just how tenuous the American supply line was, with one small narrow-gauge railway which could support about 20% of II Corps' needs, and with trucks attempting to make up the difference on low-quality roads, which caused all forms of stress and breakdowns on those trucks. That the Americans were even able to maintain what they had was only because of the hijacking of enough shipping to conduct an emergency delivery of 5,000 trucks and a whole bunch of replacement parts. Regardless, if there was a date which will live in infamy in the history of the US Army of World War II, that date would be the date of the battle at Sidi Bouzid. A screening line of tanks was sent out by the Americans to provide warning of any impending attack from Kasserine Pass and to delay them. However, that warning was never sounded. One source says that the command tank was destroyed almost immediately, and the remainder of the company lost comms with Higher. Another source says that a major who was the TC of the command tank had overslept, and the force went without him. Regardless, the first warning that anybody near City had of trouble was the sound of a tank battle reaching them, which also meant that the pre-planned artillery pasting of Kasserine Pass to disrupt the enemy coming out of the pass never happened. The tank company was basically wiped out. Another company set out to stabilize the situation and was also wiped out. Part of the problem was that though the terrain was pretty flat and open between the passes, a sandstorm was whipping around which blocked observation, so the true scale of what was out there was not immediately obvious. Things were not helped by repeated German air attacks, which went unopposed by US fighters. Infantry battalions on hilltops, placed specifically to Fredendall's instructions, though contrary to the opinions of 1st Armored Division officers, as they could not support each other, were safe from the panzers which couldn't get to them, but were shortly to become isolated. It very soon became clear that this was no small diversionary attack, such as Anderson had thought might occur, and that Combat Command A, under Colonel McQuillan, was not going to hold Sidi Bouzid. With McQuillan being one of the last to leave, 3rd Battalion 1st Armoured under Hightower fought a desperate covering action. On the receiving end of 8.8 fire from both ground-mounted and Tiger-mounted guns, they forced the Germans to pay a cost. But by the end of the day, the battalion was down to 7 tanks out of the 44 with which they had started. Hightower's own tank claimed 4 before being knocked out. The crew walked away from the battlefield before finding a half-track and hitching a lift. Still, though, the Americans were not sure of the sheer size of the force arrayed against them. Anderson still felt that the main German strike was still to come, in the northern direction. On this basis, Fredendall was reluctant to authorize the withdrawal of the infantry regiments on the Jebels, the hilltops, east of Sidi. Similarly, Ward, in 1st Armoured, believed McQuillan had overestimated the size of the enemy and that he was able to retake the town, but requested of Fredendall all of Robinette's CCB. Fredendall agreed and forwarded the request to Anderson. Still convinced that the main German hammer was yet to fall on Fonduc in his area, Anderson released only a single battalion of tanks, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Alger. Being a little more concerned than Anderson was about the city problem, Fredendall also sent forth a tank battalion from the Corps Reserve to help out, belonging to Lieutenant Colonel Crosby. In theory, this was precisely the sort of reason that the tank destroyer battalions existed, but the reality was that they had been piecemealed out by platoons and companies, and it was impossible to get a concentration of them together. Meanwhile, over on the German side of things, some caution. The local commander, Ziegler, who had achieved his mission of breaking out of the pass and taking Sidi Bouzid, didn't realize how much he had attrited the US force. He also figured that the Americans were likely to counterattack, so he decided to dig in and await it. Rommel felt that the success needed to be exploited, not to sit still, but von Arnim, still contemplating a Fonduc move to the north, felt that the cautious approach was acceptable. Although Ward and Fredendall had by now figured out the obvious, there was a strong enemy presence, they obviously didn't realize just how strong. Or maybe they would not have sent forth the attack, which they did, of Alger's battalion supported by infantry and artillery. Multiple dive bomber attacks disrupted the Americans before the battle even started, and ambushed by superior numbers of tanks from multiple sides, the American tank battalion was wiped out. 4 tanks remained. That night, half a battalion escaped their isolation behind German lines. Although the Germans had attempted to reduce one of the 2 isolated infantry positions, they were rebuffed by determined Americans. But it was obvious that they would not be relieved anytime soon, so a message was dropped by air to start to withdraw. When the Germans figured it out, Ziegler detached a number of units to help mop up, but this also meant that he gave the Americans further west, at Spetla, more time. As it was, Fredendall also sent engineers to Kasserine, 20 miles even further west than Sebetla, to start building defenses there. Also, Anderson finally realized that the intelligence was in fact wrong, and released Robinette and the rest of its Combat Command to go south to Spetla, where it met up with what was left of Combat Command A. Similarly, Fredendall requested, and Anderson agreed to, the withdrawal of troops on his northern flank to cover Spibba Pass. After Spetla, the road would split into two routes through the western ridge, one to Kasserine and one to Spibba. An attacking force could choose either route, or even both. Spibba would go north into the French and British sectors, Kasserine west, staying in the American. After a small clash a few miles east of Spetla in an area named Kern's Crossroads, 1st Armored Division, finally operating as a single unit, settled into defensive positions around Spetla itself and waited for the next German attack. As a generally intact division, and with CCB's combat-tested troops, the Americans were confident. In a rare night advance by the Germans, chaos began to reign, and CCA units started to break, thinking that the Germans had broken through somewhere, and things cascaded from there. The German commander, Ziegler, was himself somewhat confused. He was receiving reports that the Americans were abandoning Spetla, but at the same time he was also getting reports of strong resistance. What was happening was that one set of reports was referring to the rout of much of CCA, whilst the other set of reports were coming from those troops that were encountering Robinette's CCB, and a couple of units of CCA which hadn't broken and had no intention of leaving. As a result, Ziegler remained cautious. Unfortunately, by this point the confusion of reporting had reached two corps as well, and Fredendall was under the impression that Spetla was falling. Ward, commanding 1st Armoured and suffering from the same confusing reports, was telling him that his 1st Armoured Division might be lost as a whole. Orders were given for 1st Armoured to fall back through Kasserine, which occurred in generally good order after a brief fight by CCB which destroyed a number of tanks on both sides. In the meantime, Fredendall had, with the approval of Anderson, pulled back his right flank considerably, letting an Italian-German force advance uncontested. A line on the eastern side of Kasserine Pass was manned by engineers with some support, but the entire eastern plains were surrendered to the Axis. Rommel, commanding the southern flank opposite Fredendall, believed that the opportunity was presented to slice through the US positions and sweep north, maybe as far as the Mediterranean, and isolate the British forces. His counterpart to the north, von Arnim, was not so enthralled by this, and Rommel requested that higher command, namely Kesselring and the Italian Comando Supremo, arbitrate. Eventually they gave Rommel the go-ahead, albeit wanting a shorter sweep, turning north after passing through the passes, instead of continuing west a bit through the town of Tebessa. Kesselring had believed that the wording did actually give Rommel the flexibility to go west first, but it turned out that Rommel hadn't read things the same way. The arguing and dithering on the Axis side, though, did give two corps and the Allies as a whole a bit of breathing space. A new ground commander, Alexander, arrived, and he took over in the middle of the battle. His orders were simple enough. No more retreating after the western dorsal, of which Kasserine and Spibba passes were a part. The disposition of forces is difficult to recount without the aid of a map and just by audio podcasts, and thus it's a bit tricky. But generally speaking, Spibba was strongly held by a multinational force of British, French, and Americans, while Kasserine was held by Americans with a few French artillery units and a British armoured brigade. The pass itself was mainly held by American infantry, engineers, and tank destroyers, but the defensive positions were poorly established due to a variety of reasons, to include poor communications between the various supposedly mutually supporting units. Mines were poorly laid. The flaws were identified by daybreak, but there was no time to fix them before the Axis attack began. Some initial probes were sent back, but the engineers were raw, unblooded, and frankly not true riflemen. A number broke. Fredendall decided he needed an experienced officer in charge and called up Colonel Stark, who had been quite successful in combat up until that point. Unfortunately, despite his instructions to pull a Stonewall Jackson, Clark had no time to put things to his liking before the German attack started. Kasserine Pass itself, which held a road, railroad, and river, was at its narrowest but 800 yards wide. However, the terrain to each side was certainly not impassable to infantry, and the Germans sent a recon battalion to flank the pass on both sides and attempt to seize it quickly, in the hopes that the Americans had chosen to set up a reception at the outskirts of the pass. No such luck. The Americans weren't going to be turfed out by a mere battalion. The German recon troops decided to fall back and let the major line units have a crack. The local German commander was a chap named Boileaus. Being somewhat economical, he sent 2 more battalions in, including tanks, but they got no further. Lacking the air support that the Germans normally relied upon to break a defensive line, and receiving particularly the specialty of French and American forces, artillery, plus, frankly, some pretty resolute engineers playing riflemen behind one of the minefields, which was actually well laid, the attempt failed. Rommel had swung by Boileaus' command center and told him that he wanted to push his main attack through Spibba, but that Kasserine was desired as a distraction. After passing through, Boileaus was to threaten westwards. Boileaus responded that he would have the pass that day. Well, the day ended and he didn't have the pass. He did, however, have some infiltration troops on the hills, keeping the jumpy American engineers quite jumpy. It turned out that Rommel's other commander, Hildebrandt, didn't have the Spibba pass either. 21st Panzer was thoroughly rebuffed by well-laid minefields and murderous artillery fire. Rommel pondered and decided that Spibba was a losing proposition. He'd change his weight of effort to Kasserine and ordered 10th Panzer to drive west. Unfortunately, the weather was bad, and the Americans had thoroughly chewed up the roads with their own vehicles. The tanks moved slowly. They were also a little bit under strength, particularly because the Tiger Battalion had been kept by Arnhem for his own project to the north. Rommel summoned the Italians to the rescue, taking some elements from Centauro Division to redress 10th Panzer's lack of strength. In the meantime, Friedendahl was making his own movements, sending reinforcements into the pass and recalling Robinet's CCB from the southern end of the dorsal to backstop them. The next day, 2 attacks by 5 battalions, 4 German and 1 Italian, also failed to make progress, despite being well supported by artillery and Nebelwerfers. By the afternoon, Rommel had decided that there was no point in being subtle and threw everything he had into the fray. That did the job, particularly crucial to the breakthrough being the 5th Bersaglieri. The Italians rarely seemed to get much credit for their operations at Kasserine. Once through, the Italians sent a tank unit about 5 miles west of the pass and found nothing of note. The pass itself, thus, was held by the Americans for 2 days, whilst the Allies on the far side took measures to backstop it. As the pass actually had 2 exits on the western side, Friedendahl decided to split the command. He would assign the southern exit on the Tebessa road to Robinet, and the northern exit towards Thala went to the British Brigadier Dunphy and his 26th Armour Brigade. To further confuse matters, Anderson decided to send a Brigadier Nicholson with a few more units to the area, with what was called Nick Force. He was under instructions to assume command of the various units, at least in the northern sector. Spibba Pass, in the meantime, was held for the second day. Day 3 started with more probes by Axis forces. CCB was found to be blocking the southern route and the British 17 21st Lancers the northern route, where a half-dozen Crusaders were lost, but there was evidence of a stronger line behind them. With the skies clearing, Rommel decided to wait a bit to see what aerial recon was saying about the Allied forces further to their rear. He then decided to throw most of his weight to the north against the British, but CCB was not to go without attention. Afrika Korps Panzer Grenadiers and about 40 tanks pushed against Henry Gardner's Shermans of the 2nd of the 13th Armoured Regiment, which were in defensive positions with artillery support. Stukas dove in on his artillery position, causing minor damage, but new twin caliber 50 AA mounts shot down 2 of them. The anti-air troops were quite buoyed by this, and basically then shot at anything flying. After all, they had only really seen German aircraft at that point. The Allied air forces had been busy redeploying to their rear. Unfortunately, the next couple of groups of aircraft overhead were actually American, but they were deterred enough to go home after suffering heavy damage to 5 aircraft. The German attack itself failed. If the Germans hadn't yet experienced the accuracy and flexibility of US artillery power, Kasserine was going to become as much a lesson for them as to how difficult it could be to fight Americans, as Kasserine and Sidi Bouzid had been for the Americans as to how difficult it could be to fight Germans. Under heavy artillery fire plus long-range fire from Gardner's tanks, the Germans abandoned the effort. The American tank battalion came out of the fight without a single loss. In the meantime, in the south, elements of Terry Allen's 1st Division and M3 mediums from CCB's 13th Armoured Regiment managed to throw back some Germans and Italians from some hilltops to secure the American lines. Things did not go so well for the British holding the northern road to Thala, however. After a quiet morning, 10th Panzer started to place pressure on the British, the Crusaders losing out to the heavier panzers, which advanced with their infantry slowly and deliberately. After about 3 hours of this, the British lost their first line and were at their main line of defence. Rommel, impatient at the lack of progress, took over the fight and ordered a much more aggressive attack, eventually turning the British out of their main line. The British passed through their final line of resistance, but then so did the Germans, as they had placed a captured Valentine at the head of their column. Plus, it was getting dark. A furious melee started, broken almost by an unspoken mutual agreement, as troops of both sides withdrew about a kilometre after several hours of fighting. The British attempted to scrape together what sort of a defence line they could, while the Germans regrouped for one more push into Thala. The British had bought time for the US cavalry, however, although the cavalry in this case were actually artillery. 4 days earlier, 9th Division's artillery, under Brigadier General Irwin, had been told to take 3 of his 4 battalions and 2 cannon companies and head east to Debessa. The problem? He was over 700 miles away. Averaging 180 miles a day, he arrived in Thala that night, where the British had been told to expect him and had already surveyed artillery positions. He brought no small amount of firepower. The British had 2 dozen 25-pounders, good artillery pieces which caused the Germans trouble. Irwin, however, had brought along 12 155s, 24 105s, and 12 75s, with plenty of ammunition. In the morning, the enemy position on the ridgeline barely 2 kilometers away became visible, which meant that the American artillery positions were visible as well. As a result, as soon as German positions became visible to the gunners, they started sending rounds in that direction. To add to the German surprise, Nicholson sent a counterattack of Crusaders in, but after the full day of operation, barely a half dozen were still functioning well enough to reach German lines, where they were all knocked out. However, the combination of heavy artillery fire and aggressive tank action gave to the Germans the impression that a counterattack was coming. The Germans decided to postpone their own attack until they could meet it. Yet no American attack came. The Germans remained under not only artillery fire but P-38s joined the fray as well. Over 100 sorties were made by the US Army Air Forces. One, a flight of B-17s, ordered to bomb Kasserine Pass, got utterly lost and instead bombed a town 100 miles away behind enemy lines. Eisenhower authorized the release of blood money, as per Arab custom. CCB also ended up in somewhat confused action that day, as German units, lost in the night, ended up in the middle of American lines. They made a game show of it. As dawn broke, they found themselves in an artillery unit and turned the guns on Americans, but in the end, Robinette's men restored the situation, taking several hundred prisoners. II Corps' actions were similarly confused. When Fredendall was touring some of the frontline units, an unknown, jumpy staff officer at II Corps took some of the reporting coming in to mean that Corps headquarters was under threat, and he instructed a jump to the rear. Fredendall returned to find most of his headquarters had gone missing, so Ward and Nicholson had to sort out what arrangements they could directly between themselves, until Fredendall could find his command again. The next day, again, German air reconnaissance went for a look-see. There was no obvious sign of additional weakening in the Allied lines, no signs of withdrawal or panic, and there were signs of additional reinforcements coming to aid. It seemed to Rommel that there was no further benefit to attacking. There would be no chance of achieving a breakthrough behind the British. He started to withdraw his forces back to the east to face Montgomery's inexorable advance. The battle was over as far as the Germans were concerned, but they had neglected to inform the Allies. After hearing of the discord between Fredendall and Ward, Eisenhower summoned General Ernst Hermann, to go try to smooth things over. He had been the second in command of 2nd Armoured Division, which was too far to the rear to participate in any of the Kasserine activities. Under instructions to do pretty much anything except relieve Ward, because Eisenhower was hearing that Ward was being hobbled by Friedendahl, he flew to Tunisia and got to the 2 Corps command post as the last day of fighting was happening. When he got there, an exhausted Friedendahl, who was so groggy from lack of sleep that Harman had initially thought he was drunk, basically handed him a set of prepared orders saying, "Take over 1st Armoured and British 6th Armoured, prevent the Germans from taking Thala, drive them out." To one extent, this can be considered an abdication of responsibility, who is basically handing over the battle to Harman. On the other hand, Friedendahl may well have decided that a fresh, rested body would make better decisions with more energy, an assessment difficult to argue against. Regardless, Harman set about things with gusto, overriding an order from Anderson to move 9th Division's artillery to a more northern position. The Allies continued to hold their positions, now confident that they could repulse the next day's attacks. Again, as soon as it was light, American artillery started to barrage the German positions, but elicited no response. Nothing happened. Nothing continued to happen, with quite some alacrity, all morning. Then, in the late afternoon, the British decided that they had seen enough nothing, stopped firing and sent out some recon units, which discovered that the Germans had gone. The British moved forward to their old defensive line. It was now the Allies' turn to be cautious. Eisenhower was of the opinion that the Germans may be in no condition to resist an Allied push, but the commanders on the scene were concerned about possible German sneakiness, to include maybe just pulling back to prepare for another attack even further to the flank. A cautious advance followed, and the Americans retook Kasserine Pass without a shot being fired. Just some mines needed to be picked up. It became clear that the Axis had abandoned their attack and moved to a more defensive stance. As the Allies took stock of the situation, it was inevitable that changes would have to occur. Anderson's future career was not to go much further in the war. He received a KCB and a US Legion of Merit, but he didn't have the greatest confidence of Alexander, who only kept Anderson in place to avoid changing horses mid-race, or of Montgomery, who described him as completely unfit to command any army and a good plain cook. He was eventually sent back to Eastern Africa, from whence he came. It was viewed as a demotion. Friedendahl, of course, was removed promptly afterwards. He had lost the confidence of his subordinates. That conflict, together with questions from Alexander as to Friedendahl's fitness, resulted in Eisenhower removing him from command. To quote from Eisenhower's book Crusade in Europe, "I had no intention of recommending Friedendahl for a reduction, or of placing the blame for the initial defeats in the Kasserine battle on his shoulders, and I so informed him. Several others, including myself, shared responsibility for our week of reverses. But morale in the 2 Corps was shaken, and the troops had to be picked up quickly. For such a job, Patton had no superior in the army, whereas I believe Friedendahl was better suited for a training job in the States than he was for battle leadership. I recommended to General Marshall that Friedendahl be given command of an army in the United States, where he became Lieutenant General. Friedendahl eventually took over 2nd Army, responsible for the training of a large number of the divisions which eventually went overseas, an activity at which he seems to have been successful. Ward himself, who was kept on a basis that either Friedendahl will go or Ward will go, didn't last long. Despite being ordered to personally lead a night attack by Patton, and being wounded in the eye, receiving a DSC and Silver Star, Patton considered him not aggressive enough. Patton replaced him with Harman not much more than 6 weeks later. Harman himself eventually lost confidence in Robinette of CCB, who had performed so well around Kasserine. But Robinette was seriously wounded by artillery before Harman could get around to relieving him, and sent to the US to command the Armored School in Fort Knox. McQuillan of CCA didn't last much longer. He found himself sent to command the western defenses of the continental US's Pacific coast. Overall, on the tally sheet, it wasn't a great score for the Allies. Over 3,000 men became casualties and nearly 3,000 more prisoners. 180 tanks were lost, equivalent to over 3 full battalions, plus 600 other vehicles, including a number of tank destroyers. The Axis had lost about 1,500 people all told, and barely 24 tanks. However, wars are not won by kill tallies, and the battles around Kasserine gave the US military a very useful opportunity for self-assessment and improvement, whilst the Germans had attempted and failed to remove the threat from the west before Montgomery closed in from the east. Right, I hope you found this all interesting and informative. I am Nicholas Moran, the Chieftain, and I'll talk to you on the next episode of What's the Story?
Thanks for listening to What's the Story? Subscribe to us on your favorite podcast platform or listen to us on YouTube at youtube.com/World of Tanks NA. Visit worldoftanks.com to sign up to play World of Tanks or dive into more historical videos, podcasts, and articles.